So this happened right before my 20th birthday, when I was in the U.S. Navy. I was stationed at a Navy school in South Carolina for the entirety of my enlistment, close to Charleston but not actually in the city. It wasn't uncommon for people with cars to drive into the city, and everyone was friends with someone who had a car. My class leader and I, we'll call him Percy, were really close, and he was friends with this New Yorker that I didn't like much. We'll call him Tom. But Tom had a car, so we ended up doing a lot together. One night after all three of us had bombed an important test, I convinced them to go for ice cream. We decided on this little shop on the far side of Charleston and piled into Tom's truck. After we had gotten our ice cream, Percy went to start giving Tom directions. Tom couldn't find his way out of a shoebox, but Tom insisted he knew a shortcut, and we needed to just enjoy the ride. We didn't have anything early the next day, so I figured this would probably be a funny story later when Tom gets us lost. So we're driving for at least twice as long as it would have taken to get back to base, but Tom keeps promising we're almost there. Meanwhile, we haven't seen a building in at least 10 miles, and the road is so dark I feel like I'm looking into the abyss. Tom mentions that he has to pee, so Percy and I tell him to just pull over and take a leak. The road was lined with a forest, so he had options to save his dignity, but he insists on pulling all the way off the road. So Tom finds a dirt road and turns down it, and Percy and I look at each other and both say he needs to stop. Percy and I are both from the South, while Tom grew up in mostly New York, so Percy and I both knew how real shoot first, ask questions later can be. But Tom kept saying he was just going to go a little further through the trees. I'm thinking about how we're going to get shot because I wanted ice cream when we break through the tree line. About 20 yards in front of us was a big bonfire that was bright compared to the light from the new moon. Immediately, my stomach dropped, and Percy and I both started screaming at Tom to turn around. That's when we noticed the figures around the fire, and those closing in around us. Tom was frozen in the driver's seat, so I reached into the front and put the truck in reverse while hitting him repeatedly in the shoulder. Tom slowly turned around to check behind him to back up, only for him to freeze again. I turned and saw more figures closing around the trail behind us. Percy by now had pulled out a flashlight and was trying to blind the figures while repeatedly telling Tom to just go and that they'd move. So Tom starts to slowly make his way back while Percy's whipping his flashlight around, and I'm making sure all the doors are locked and rolling up the rear windows and closing the back sliding window. The crowd parted like we were Moses and they were the Red Sea, and we made it back onto the road without any other problems. We rode the rest of the way in almost complete silence, and the three of us have never actually spoken about it since. The only thing that was said on the ride home was when Percy turned to me and said, "They didn't have faces." I'm not a stranger to weird dreams. The majority of them turn scary in some way, but this one was all too real for me. A few years ago, when I was back in high school, I had gone to sleep and had begun to dream about an odd place. I remember it had maroon walls and deep red carpeting. It reminded me a lot of a suit parlor, if that's anything. I started seeing some of my older relatives walking around me, such as my grandmother brushing dust off my clothes, etc. Everyone around me had a very somber demeanor about them, and I had no idea why. At some point, some people I didn't recognize began moving around me as well, and I finally asked what was happening. One of the men I did not recognize essentially told me that I was dying, and I was being prepared for the afterlife. They conceded and told me that I would be allowed one more day to live to say goodbye to those I care about. And then I woke up. I never tend to take dreams seriously, as they are often bizarre enough, but what could I do? I was upset for the better part of the day, telling some of my friends at school about what I had dreamt. Considering how I was acting that day, I was surprised by how little they seemed to care. Later in the day, I brushed it off as an unsettling dream and nothing more. In the evening, myself and 2 other students from the school were practicing for our driver's permit exam, sharing one car, and taking turns driving it across the county, with the instructor sitting in the passenger seat. Since this was after school and everyone needed enough time to practice their driving, this thing ran until after sundown. Once everyone had gotten their turns in, the instructor asked if anyone would like to volunteer to drive back to the school in the dark, which my confident self agreed to do. As we were driving back to the school, we were going along a road with a large number of curves, with steep hills on one side of the road, which meant that it was hard to see around the other side. With the other two students asleep in the back seat, I myself was thinking how well I had been doing at driving. Then, bright headlights came around one of the curves. My instructor immediately reached over to pull the steering wheel to avoid colliding head-on with a Jeep. If my instructor hadn't been paying attention, I almost certainly would have hit that car, and it would have hit my side of the car the hardest. I firmly believe that I was meant to die that day. This happened a few years back. I was with my family. I'm 11 at the time, driving in the middle of nowhere in Montana in the dead of winter. We used to own this place out in the literal middle of nowhere, and every once in a while we'd drive out and spend a week fishing, camping, and hiking. So we were driving back toward civilization. Everyone was tired. Big walls of snow on either side of the road. Beyond the dirty snowbanks, you could see really thick tree lines. We were cruising along, climbing up over this mountain pass. I remember I had half of my forehead pressed against the cold glass while I tiredly watched what little snow and nature I could make out in the dark when I saw this person. I'll always remember her as female. Either way, they were wearing a tattered coat, multiple layers, carrying a couple of big bags, and I remember seeing a flash of a cold face. I wasn't the only one to see her. My dad mumbled, "See that? Must be freezing out there." My mom said something like, maybe we should give them a ride. But we were already a half-mile away. My little sister was asleep, but the talking roused her, and when I told her what I saw, maybe I added a couple of creepy details like a hook for a hand or something, she got creeped out and kept her eyes glued to the window for the next few miles. So we get to the top of this mountain and we begin the descent down the other side. The driving conditions weren't great, but the old family car was doing just fine. We leveled out a bit and I started scanning the distance for any signs of the city, towns, anything. Nothing. Snow. Trees. Totally alone. We began the real descent when we started winding down this mountain pass. Hairpin turns. Everyone's on edge. Mom tries to get us to go back to sleep, but I can't. I have this funny feeling. I'm staring out the window at the snow and trees. We haven't passed a car for what seemed like hours. I remember my dad starts talking about something. And that's when I see her again, standing out in the snow. I get a brief glimpse where they are illuminated by the headlights but then gone, streaming past us into the dark. Okay, so this time I got a better look at her face and I wish I hadn't. A really strange smile in the middle of a very disfigured face. Maybe like a horrible burn. In that brief second, I can't get the image out of my head. It felt like she was staring right at me, smiling, some messed up kind of understanding in her small black eyes. So we drive on for a bit. I remember just staring out the window. It immediately struck me, how did she get there? How could she travel miles and miles in front of us? We didn't pass a car, truck, anything. And there wasn't any other road out there. So this part of my story I get a bit hazy on, mainly because I don't really remember. I just sort of remember sitting there thinking, trying to make sense of it all. We get to the bottom of that mountain and make it to some roadside motel, and we all stamp the snow off our boots before walking into the room. I didn't sleep much. Next morning we found this little diner right outside the town we stayed in. Classic trucker stop. We ate. After the bill was paid and we zipped up our coats, I heard the door chime. We all were heading out, and I looked up and saw her again. Same coat, the dozens of hooded sweaters, the big bags filled with what looked like damp clothing. I was walking out behind my dad. He towered over me, but I remember this look she gave me as she passed. She really looked like she hated me, like she enjoyed the idea of someone suffering, all with that big disfigured smile. She stopped beside me, but I stayed behind my dad until we got to the car. I don't know what really was going on. Couldn't help but feel bad for her, if she truly was lost out there, if maybe someone had hurt her. Probably a dozen explanations, but can't shake the weird feeling like she was following us.